For centuries, legends around the world have spoken about giants, massive beings said to have walked the earth long before modern civilization. Ancient texts mention them, mythologies describe them, and strange archaeological discoveries have kept the mystery alive. Were these stories just myths passed down through generations, or could there be something more behind them? The truth might be stranger than fiction. Join us, and let's explore the mystery of where the giants may have gone. Let's go.
Number 13. Giant human remains Middle East archaeological discoveries. The Middle East is the geographic heart of the giant question, as presented in ancient texts. The Rephaim, the Anakim, the Emim, and the Zamzamim are distinct categories of giant peoples listed in Hebrew texts, with tribal names, geographic territories, and military histories. These are not grouped under a single catch-all category. They are treated as distinct populations with different characteristics, which is exactly how you would expect a genuine historical record to handle multiple large populations encountered in different regions. The land of Canaan, which the Israelites were instructed to take from its current inhabitants, was explicitly described as populated by giants who made the incoming scouts feel like insects by comparison. That description was used to argue against the military campaign, meaning the size of the opposition was presented as a practical military concern, not a literary embellishment. Archaeological work in the region has produced physical evidence of unusual human stature across multiple sites. Excavations at Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, uncovered skeletal material from multiple periods with size variations that researchers have noted without fully addressing. The broader issue is that Middle Eastern archaeological sites are among the most politically sensitive in the world. Access is controlled by multiple competing governments, religious authorities, and military interests. Independent examination of unusual material is difficult to arrange and even more difficult to publish without institutional backing. The result is that the documentary record, which is extensive, sits alongside a physical record that is fragmentary, controlled, and largely inaccessible. The texts say the giants were there. The landscape they described is real. The bones are in collections that do not welcome questions.
Number 12. Robert Wadlow, tallest human ever, world record giant. Before dismissing the idea that humans can reach extraordinary heights, Robert Wadlow is the checkpoint that shuts down the argument. Wadlow was born in 1918 in Alton, Illinois. He died in 1940 at the age of 22. At the time of his death, he stood 8 feet 11 inches tall and was still growing. His condition, hyperplasia of the pituitary gland, caused unchecked production of growth hormone throughout his life. His hands measured 12.5 inches. His shoes were size 37. He required leg braces to walk in his final years because his body had outgrown its own structural capacity. Wadlow is significant to the giant discussion, not as a medical curiosity, but as a proof of biological range. He was not a myth or a legend. He was photographed extensively, visited by millions of people across the United States, and examined repeatedly by doctors who documented every measurement with precision. He was human, genetically modern, and vastly larger than the accepted norm. If a single genetic disruption in the 20th century could produce an individual nearly 9 feet tall, then a population in which that trait was normalized, whether through genetics, environment, or selection, could have produced individuals consistently larger. Wadlow is what one person looks like when the growth mechanism runs unchecked. The ancient records don't describe individuals like Wadlow, anomalous and alone. They describe populations where that scale was ordinary. The biology exists. The question is, what conditions could have made it widespread, and what conditions eventually ended it?
I'm going to ask you a simple question. Are you a naturally curious person? If you're watching, I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. This space is made for people like us. To ensure you're always part of this community and receive all our latest discoveries, you just need to do one thing: subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to stay connected with us. Okay, now that you're part of our Legion of the Curious, let's move on to the next item.
Number 11. Giant Skeletons Newspaper Reports 1800s America. The 19th century American press was not subtle. Newspapers competed aggressively for readers and traded sensational discovery as front-page territory. When giant skeletons began appearing across the Midwest, the newspapers printed the stories in detail. What makes those reports historically significant is not their sensationalism, it's their specificity.
Accounts from papers including the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, and dozens of regional outlets described bone discoveries with measurements, locations, and named witnesses. These were not tabloid rumors. They were reported as straightforward news items with the same factual tone applied to business openings and court proceedings. The August 10, 1891 edition of the New York Times described the discovery of a giant skeleton during the excavation of a burial mound in Crittenden County, Arkansas. The remains were estimated at 9 feet tall. The report named the excavators and described the anatomical features in clinical language. This was a document of record, printed by one of the most respected publications in the country. Similar reports appeared from Wisconsin, Ohio, West Virginia, Indiana, Illinois, and Minnesota. The frequency was not occasional. It was sustained over decades. Dozens of reports, consistent in their descriptions across independent locations and witnesses, described the same categories of physical characteristics. Double rows of teeth appeared in multiple unrelated accounts, unusual skull shapes, extreme bone density, massive jaw structures. These specifics lined up across reports from people who had no contact with each other. That kind of independent corroboration is exactly what historians use to establish that something happened. The reports are archived, searchable, and specific. The bones are gone.
Number 10. Giant human footprints archaeological sites worldwide. Footprints fossilized in stone tell a story that cannot be edited after the fact. The Burapur giant footprints in India measure 28 inches in length. If those proportions scaled to a human body at the same ratio as a modern adult foot, the individual who made them stood approximately 10 to 11 feet tall. The prints are embedded in sandstone, physically real, and have been examined by researchers. They are not artwork. They are not erosion patterns shaped to look like feet. The pressure distribution follows the biomechanical signature of a walking gait. Across South Africa, near the town of Mapaluzi, a single massive footprint is pressed into granite. Geologists who have examined it confirm that the impression required enormous weight applied to the stone during a period when the rock was in a malleable state. The estimated date of that event is controversial, but the physical impression exists regardless of when it was made. In Ecuador, massive stone footprints were found alongside oversized hand tools, axes, and grinding stones scaled to hands far larger than any modern humans. The tools are not symbolic, they are functional objects sized for practical use, which means the people using them were proportionally larger. The Liotoli footprints in Tanzania, often cited in human evolution discussions, include prints that researchers initially attributed to modern-sized hominids, but which show stride lengths inconsistent with that classification. These prints were found in the same geological layer as tracks widely accepted as ancient. Physical evidence pressed into stone cannot be updated to suit a later narrative. It just sits there, too large to explain and too specific to dismiss. Number 9. Biblical Nephilim giants, historical evidence. The Old Testament does not treat giants as mythology. The text handles them as a documented population problem, entities that complicated the political and military landscape of the ancient Near East. The Nephilim appear in Genesis as the offspring of divine beings and human women, described as mighty and renowned. Numbers describes Canaanite scouts returning from the land of giants and reporting that the Israelites looked like grasshoppers by comparison. These are not poetic flourishes. They are described within texts that simultaneously detail logistics, geography, and military strategy with a specificity that scholars use for historical cross-referencing. The Canaanite king Og of Bashan is given a detail that archaeological texts rarely invent. His iron bed measured approximately 13 feet long. That kind of specific measurement in an ancient text is either a fabrication or a record. The books of Samuel describe Goliath with dimensions placing him at around 9 to 11 feet, depending on the manuscript tradition used. What makes these accounts remarkable is not their existence in isolation, it's their convergence with records from entirely separate civilizations. Sumerian texts describe Anunnaki giants. Egyptian records reference ruling figures of extraordinary height. Greek mythology names the Titans and giants as predecessors to the current world order. Mesopotamian tablets describe the pre-flood world as populated by beings of enormous size, whose violence drove divine intervention. Every major ancient civilization, operating without contact with each other, produced the same category of being. That level of convergence across independent cultures is not typically dismissed in other historical contexts. It is typically treated as evidence.
Number 8. Charles Darwin Evolution Theory, Giant Human Ancestors. The theory of evolution, as applied to human development, presents giants with a structural problem that is rarely addressed directly. The standard model describes human ancestors growing progressively larger in brain size and smaller in raw physical mass as intelligence became the dominant survival advantage. This trajectory moves consistently in one direction, towards smaller, more efficient, more cognitively advanced forms. Giants don't fit that trajectory. They represent a divergence from the standard narrative, a branch of humanoid development that went toward greater physical size rather than refined intelligence. Evolutionary theory does not actually prohibit this. Side branches and dead ends are a normal feature of evolutionary history. The problem is not biological, it's archaeological. A population of giant humans would have left evidence. Their bones would be oversized, their tools would be oversized, their shelters and burial sites would reflect their scale. And those things have been found, repeatedly, across every continent. The evolutionary framework has no formal designation for these beings. They are not Homo sapiens by the physical measurements on record. They are not Neanderthals or Denisovans, whose remains have been cataloged and accepted. They occupy a gap between the officially recognized species that academia has not chosen to fill. That silence is not a gap in the evidence. The evidence is there. It is a gap in the willingness to incorporate findings that don't align with a model that has been in place for over a century and a half. New data is always difficult for established frameworks. Giant data is especially difficult because it requires rewriting not just one section of the story, but the entire first chapter.
Number 7. Lovelock Cave, Nevada, Giant Skeletons, 1912. The Nevada High Desert is not a place associated with extraordinary discovery. It is dry, remote, and largely overlooked, which may be exactly why what was found in Lovelock Cave in 1912 remained in circulation long enough to be documented before institutional silence arrived. The cave had been used as a guano mine for years before workers began turning up unusual material below the surface layers. When the Nevada Historical Society and the University of California sent researchers to formally excavate the site, what they found defied expectation. The remains recovered included individuals estimated to stand well over 6 feet, which would have been unremarkable except for additional physical characteristics. The hair preserved on several specimens was distinctly reddish, not as a result of decomposition, which typically darkens organic material, but as a natural pigment inconsistent with the indigenous populations known to the region. The skulls were elongated and the jaw structures were heavier than typical. Written accounts from the Paiute people, gathered by ethnographers in the same period, described a race of red-haired cannibalistic giants called the Site-Ka, who had been driven into the cave and burned alive by a coalition of tribes after generations of conflict. The cave showed evidence of an ancient fire consistent with that account. The physical remains matched the description. This was not a myth attached to bones found later. It was a legend that matched independent archaeological evidence in specific detail. University researchers published their findings. Newspapers covered the story nationally. Then the remains were absorbed into institutional collections, and the conversation simply stopped.
Number 6. Patagonian Giants, Magellan Expedition Historical Account. Ferdinand Magellan's 1520 voyage around the tip of South America produced one of the most frequently cited and most aggressively debated giant encounters in the historical record. When the expedition made landfall in what is now southern Argentina, crew members recorded an encounter with native people of extraordinary physical size. The account, written by expedition chronicler Antonio Pigafetta, described a man so large that the Spanish sailors reached only to his waist. The native man was painted, armed, and initially not hostile. Magellan named the people Patagones, a term derived from a word for large foot, giving both the people and the region, Patagonia, their names. Pigafetta's account was detailed and consistent with subsequent entries. The crew eventually captured 2 of the giants, intending to bring them back to Spain as proof, but both died during the voyage. This single detail, the deaths of the captives, is worth noting. If the giants had survived and arrived in Spain, the physical evidence would have been undeniable and the historical conversation would have been different. Their deaths closed the loop conveniently. Subsequent expeditions to the same region reported the same population. The English navigator Francis Drake's crew recorded similar encounters in 1578. The Dutch Siebel de Weer described giant natives in 1598. Multiple independent European expeditions across nearly a century describe the same people in the same location with the same unusual physical characteristics. This is not one explorer exaggerating for prestige. This is a pattern of documentation across nations and decades. The Tehuelche people of Patagonia were tall. That is confirmed even by modern anthropological records. The question is, how tall?
Number 5. Red-haired giants, Canary Islands, Guanche people evidence. The Canary Islands sit off the northwest coast of Africa, far enough from the mainland to have developed their population in relative isolation. When Spanish explorers arrived in the 14th and 15th centuries, they encountered the Guanche people, a native population with physical characteristics that immediately struck the newcomers as unusual. Multiple contemporary accounts describe the Guanche as significantly taller than the average European of the period. Some individuals were recorded at heights placing them above 7 feet. The skeletal remains recovered from Guanche burial sites, some of which have been formally studied by Spanish and German researchers, support these accounts with bone measurements that exceed modern human norms. The Guanche also presented another characteristic that cut across explorer accounts consistently: red and blonde hair appearing alongside fair or ruddy skin tones. This phenotype did not match the surrounding North African and Sub-Saharan populations. The Guanche had no written language, but their oral traditions described themselves as survivors, people who had arrived on the islands after a great catastrophe and maintained their civilization in isolation. They built structures and practiced mummification with a sophistication that suggested prior knowledge of more advanced techniques. Genetic studies conducted in the early 21st century confirmed that the Guanche was not related to the populations one would expect given their geographic position. Their closest documented genetic relatives were Berber populations from the Atlas Mountains, but the physical divergences remain unexplained. The red hair, the height, and the isolation timeline don't close neatly into a conventional narrative. Researchers who pursue these threads find the data trails going quiet in the same way they do everywhere else.
Number 4. Ancient giant civilizations megalithic construction mystery. Stand at the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza and look up. The stones used in its construction weigh between 2 and 15 tons each. The largest, used in the internal chambers, reach 80 tons. Modern engineers have studied the logistics of moving those stones using tools available in ancient Egypt and reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. It is not clearly possible at the scale required. Not impossible in theory, but not explained adequately by the tools and workforce that conventional history assigns to the project. This problem is not unique to Egypt. The megalithic walls at Sacsayhuaman in Peru contain stones exceeding 100 tons, fitted together with a precision that doesn't allow a sheet of paper between the surfaces. The people attributed to building these structures by standard archaeology were the Inca, but the Inca themselves said they did not build the lower courses. They said the walls were already there when they arrived. The ancient city of Pumapunku in Bolivia contains interlocking stone blocks of extraordinary weight, carved with machine-like precision. The stones show evidence of drilling and cutting that the technologies of their supposed construction date cannot explain. Local legends across the Andes consistently attribute construction to a race of giants who came before ordinary humans. These are not romantic origin stories. They're the same operational detail that shows up in architectural analysis. The structures required capabilities beyond the documented builders. The physical evidence and the oral tradition agree. That agreement is usually where historical investigation begins, not where it stops.
Number 3. Stature giants, pre-flood world, ancient texts evidence. The concept of a pre-flood world populated by beings of greater physical scale than modern humans appears across ancient texts with enough consistency to warrant serious examination rather than automatic dismissal. The Sumerian King List, one of the oldest written historical documents in existence, records pre-flood rulers with reigns of tens of thousands of years. Modern scholars typically interpret these numbers as mythological exaggeration, but the document is otherwise treated as a serious historical source that lines up with archaeological timelines. The text describes a different kind of being existed before the flood, larger, longer-lived, and possessing capabilities that declined sharply after the cataclysm. The Book of Enoch, a text quoted in the New Testament and considered canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, describes watchers, angelic beings who descended to earth, producing offspring called the Nephilim, who grew to enormous heights and consumed resources far beyond what the earth could sustain.
The Hindu texts describe the Satya Yuga, the first age of the world, in which humans lived for thousands of years and stood at enormous heights. As the ages progressed, human lifespan and physical stature declined with each successive cycle. The pre-flood or pre-cataclysm world described by these separate civilizations has consistent elements: greater human size, longer lifespan, advanced capability, and an event that reset everything. These texts did not influence each other. The Sumerians, the ancient Hebrews, the Hindus, and dozens of other ancient cultures developed their accounts independently. The convergence is not evidence of copying. It is evidence they were all describing the same thing.
Number 2. Ancient giant warriors Goliath, historical Philistine evidence. The story of David and Goliath is so culturally embedded that it has become primarily a metaphor, a way of describing any underdog situation. That familiarity has allowed people to forget that the biblical account is presented as history, not parable. Goliath is given a hometown, Gath. He is given armor with specific weight measurements. He is given a spear whose iron head weighs 600 shekels. These are not the details of myth. These are the logistical specifics of military documentation. The biblical account places Goliath at 6 cubits and a span in height. The measurement of a cubit varied in the ancient world, but the most common standard places Goliath between 9 and 11 feet tall. He came from a Philistine warrior tradition that apparently produced multiple giant fighters. The text later refers to other warriors from Gath described as descendants of the Rephaim, a specific category of giant in the ancient Near East taxonomy. Archaeological work at ancient Gath, modern Tel Safi in Israel, has been ongoing since 1996 under Bar Ilan University. The site has produced extensive physical evidence of a major Philistine city consistent with the period described in the biblical accounts. Researchers have found evidence of iron production, advanced military infrastructure, and material culture consistent with the described warrior society. The city was real. The cultural context was real. The question of Goliath's physical size remains archaeological rather than mythological, a matter of evidence rather than faith. And the evidence for unusually large warriors in that region from that period includes more than one text.
Number 1. Suppression giant discoveries, government institutions, evidence. The pattern is the most disturbing part. Not any single discovery, not any one report, not any individual cover-up allegation, but the pattern that emerges when you map every reported giant discovery against what happened to the evidence afterward. The outcome is the same across countries, centuries, and contexts. Physical evidence is found by credible witnesses. The initial documentation is public, reported, and specific. Then an institution with authority intervenes. The specimens are removed. Access is restricted. The official position becomes that there is nothing significant to examine. Anyone who continues asking is described as credulous or conspiratorial. The geographic spread alone makes a coordinated global conspiracy implausible. The United States, Australia, New Zealand, Peru, the Canary Islands, Greece, the Middle East, India, and Patagonia are not operating under a single institutional authority. Yet the resolution of giant discoveries in each location follows the same steps. Either the convergence of this pattern across independent institutions, governments, and cultures represents the most elaborate and successful coordination in human history, or the pattern is the result of something simpler. Institutions protect the models that give them authority. A discovery that requires rewriting the fundamental account of human history represents a threat to the credibility of every institution that has built its prestige on that account. The Smithsonian, universities, government archaeology departments, and natural history museums around the world have an enormous stake in the current model being correct. That institutional interest is not a conspiracy. It is a predictable response to uncomfortable data. Understanding the incentive doesn't make the missing bones appear, but it does explain why they keep disappearing. 15 weird laws you didn't know still exist today.
Still curious? Then don't stop now. The next mystery is already waiting for you. Just click the video on screen. I saved it just for you. See you there, curious one.